Hello, my name's Tim LeBon. I'm passionate about bringing together ideas from psychology, psychotherapy and philosophy to help you to live well. Today I'm going to talk to you about the nature of the good life and how you can lead it. This is going to be like a coaching session. So to get the most of it, I'm going to ask you to jot things down from time to time. And there's a handout which you might like to download now and maybe print out so you can write on it. That's what the handout looks like, and you can find it at www.timlebon.com Good Life Clarification. So that's www.timlebon.com/GOOD, capital LIFE, capital CLARIFICATION. Or if you want, you can just pause the video and just save as. Or if you want, you can just jot things down as we go along. Because what you can see there is a sheet that is at the moment empty, but by the end of it, we're going to have it filled in. And that is going to take you, I hope, some way towards thinking meaningfully about the good life for you. So we've been looking primarily at that first question, what's the good life? We're also going to be looking at what psychology has to say about what's conducive to living the good life in general, or well-being. And we're also going to be looking specifically at what can help you enhance your own well-being, where we'll be drawing on coaching and psychotherapy. So why should we spend our time reflecting on the good life? Well, imagine that this is your boat sailing through life. The great Greek philosopher Seneca said, if one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favourable. Think about it. If you don't know where your boat should go, other people will be pushing it somewhere or steering it somewhere, or the winds of fate will take it, goodness knows where. So maybe you think you should just steer it yourself. Well, that's equally dangerous if you're steering it in the wrong direction, if you're working towards the wrong life goals. So what we all need is a clear and wise conception of what we want from life, of the good life for us. So what do you want most from life? Jot down the top 5 ingredients of the good life for you. Now, to make this really vivid, I'd like you to indulge me in this following thought experiment. Imagine a genie walks into the room and says, tell me your vision of the good life and I can make it happen. But, there's always a catch, if you don't write anything down, you won't get anything. So you've got 30 seconds starting from now. So get writing. What's number 1? Ten seconds left. Remember, use all your 5 slots. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fantastic. So, I don't know what your 5 were, but here's one possible definition from someone who I'm going to call Emily. So there's health for herself and family, successful career, leaving the world a slightly better place, friendships, and developing her character so she can become the best version of herself. So if you like any of those, feel free to put them on your list. If you don't, then feel free to absolutely ignore them. Either is fine. So what we're going to do now is look at 4 philosophical theories of the good life. And I'm not arguing that any of them are completely right or completely wrong. And I've chosen these 4 because I think each has got something to offer. We're going to look at each of them. And as we do, think of them in a kind of sympathetic yet still critical light. So there may be elements of each theory that you would like to add to your good life definition, in which case add them as we go along. So the first theory is in many ways the simplest, and it's the idea that the good life is just happiness. So this was a view held by Epicurus in ancient Greece and Jeremy Bentham, the 19th or 18th century philosopher, utilitarian philosopher. So The idea here is that the pursuit of pleasure or happiness and the absence of pain or suffering are the only intrinsic goods. So that means that other things like health, money, fame, virtue can be good, but they're only good insofar as they lead to pleasure or the absence of pain. So this can actually, if we agree with it, this can give us a clear algorithm, if you like, to think about what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we should lead our life. A couple of things to note. Hedonism is about maximizing long-term happiness. So the hedonist might actually choose to go to the dentist because it's long-term suffering is being avoided. And it isn't, in fact, your favorite person who you're thinking of a hedonist, probably rock star, someone who's into sex and drugs and rock and roll, they are probably not a very good hedonist. So that's really interesting. Hedonism does not mean you overindulge. And another thing that makes, I think, hedonism a more attractive theory than you might think is because it pays a lot of emphasis to removing suffering. So many of these philosophers devoted a lot of their time not to living it up, but to trying to remove suffering. In Epicurus's case, with his friends, in their communities, and in Jeremy Bentham, a lot of political campaigning to make the world a better place. So modern psychology has actually done quite a lot to help us think about what happiness really means, because that's one of the things that psychology brings to the show. Is we start off with a vague term like happiness, and psychologists bring in a term like subjective well-being, which means we can define it really precisely. And what do they think it is? So psychologists like Ed Diener, who's the psychology of happiness guru and has been for a long time. So subjective well-being has three elements: overall satisfaction with life, positive effect, which you might think of as emotions, as things like joy, satisfaction, excitement, pride, and the relative absence of negative effect, emotions like guilt, shame, depression, and sadness, and anxiety as well. So if you think those three are important and they're not already captured in your values, you might want to add them to your definition of a good life. I see, or I imagine I see, that some of you are looking a bit wary of doing this. And I wonder if this guy's got anything to do with that. Because you might think that if you're happy, you'll end up like Homer Simpson. Well, actually, this is something that psychologists have looked into a lot. So how many of these good things do you think are in fact associated with happiness? Longer life, better health, higher achievement, more wealth, more better productivity, and more social behaviour. There are 6 goods. How many of them are associated with greater levels of happiness, do you think? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Well, the answer is 6. So what does that mean? It means that there are lots of good things associated with happiness. Note that doesn't necessarily mean it's causal, going from happiness to those things necessarily, and in some cases it is. For instance, the nun study suggests very strongly that happiness leads to longer life. So nuns who are happier lived up to 9 years, about 9 years longer than the ones that are least happy. In some cases it might be more bi-directional. So for instance, the more happy you are, probably the wealthier you are, but also the wealthier you are, to some extent, the happier you are. So what about the donuts question? Well, as far as I know, there is absolutely no evidence to show that being happy will make you eat more donuts. So at this point, you might well decide that you can take a chance, as Emily here has, and put all 3 on her happiness wish list. Now, you might be worried and saying, oh my God, I've only got 5 choices. The genie's going to only allow me 5. And that's true. But what I'm going to suggest is you add as many as you like and then do a little bit of narrowing it down later. So add those 3 to your good life definition if you so wish. So have we cracked it? Have we got the answer to the good life in just a few minutes? Well, possibly not, because at least Aldous Huxley is one of a number of thinkers who have argued that happiness is not the only good, and so hedonism is not an adequate theory of the good life. So Huxley invites us to imagine a society where everybody is extremely happy. How does this come about? Well, the government makes sure everybody takes Soma, happy pills, and it also genetically engineers people so they're born happy and they're indoctrinated to be happy. So it's a very tightly controlled society, but one in which, nonetheless, everybody's happy. And if they were taking subjective wellbeing questionnaires, they would all score extremely highly. Now, the thing is that Huxley thinks of this as a dystopia, not a utopia, and he expects us to do the same. So the savage, who comes from outside this society, confronts Mustafa Mond, the control of the society, with this challenge. The controller says, what's the problem? Everybody's happy. And John says, but I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. He is willing to accept lots of suffering, growing old, getting miserable, getting old, getting ill, being miserable, in return for important values such as freedom and artistic accomplishment. Now, if you think there's something in that, then it probably means you're not a hedonist, because the Brave New World is a real problem for hedonism. Because if you think about it, if happiness is the only thing that matters, then Brave New World should be a utopia. Because remember, everybody in it is very happy. So it does seem that our intuitions tell us that other things matter than happiness. In which case you might prefer theory 2 of the good life, which is Martin Seligman's PERMA theory. So Martin Seligman, who founded positive psychology, is not a hedonist, and although he includes positive emotions in his theory, he adds 4 other elements, all of which I think you'll agree are plausible additions to the good life. Being in flow, being engaged, is surely a good experience. If you've ever seen Martin Luther King give his I Have a Dream speech, and if you haven't, I suggest you do, then about halfway through it, he really gets into flow. What does that mean? He's what athletes call being in the zone. He loses track of time. He's at one with what he's doing. He's performing brilliantly, and he's almost certainly having the time of his life as well. So you may get flow from various activities. People I've asked have told me they get it from things like reading, dancing, physical activity sometimes talking with friends. I know I get it sometimes when I'm lecturing. So we don't want to say flow. It's not quite the same as positive emotion, but it's something that's very enjoyable and good. So you might want to include that. Positive relationships. Well, intimate relationships, friendships, good relationships with family and colleagues, surely they're part of the good life, whether or not they lead to positive emotions or not. Meaning, having something to wake up for, feeling you've left the world a better place, leaving a legacy, is surely important. An accomplishment, doing things well, whether you're an expert craftsman or musician or good at your job, this sense that you could do things well is something that most people want to be said about them and to be part of their life. So each of these 5 things are 5 things are quite plausible to be part of the good life, and so you might well want to add them, as Emily has, to her definition. So she hasn't had positive emotions because it's already there, but she's added the other 4. So take a moment to add any of these extra elements that you like. However, I don't believe that PERMA is a complete theory of the good life any more than hedonism is, because when we start to question it, we see some problems. So to start with, where are the few negative emotions and overall satisfaction with life which are there in subjective well-being? They're not there. And why these 5 values? Why not these 6? So Carol Riff has suggested another theory of what's called eudynamic well-being, which is called psychological well-being. So you'll see there's purpose in life and positive relationships, but there's also personal growth, self-acceptance, autonomy, environmental mastery. By the way, you can add those 4 things to your definition of the good life, or any of them if you like. But the real question is, why PERMA rather than psychological well-being? And is there a danger that theorists are promoting their own personal values, or the ones that they think are plausible, into some objective universal theory of the good life? And how could you decide between these two theories? So when I wrote my first book, Wise Therapy, I wrote a chapter about well-being, and I thought that we have really to bite the bullet and agree that the good life is at least partially subjective. What does that mean? It means that one size does not fit all. There isn't a universal list of values, and so the good life for you might be different to the good life for your neighbour. And what's really important to know is that doesn't mean that it's not worth exploring this question of the good life, or what makes life go well for you. Remember Seneca and his boat analogy? What we're saying, according to this theory, is that different people's boats are heading to different ports. But wouldn't it still be a very good idea to know where your boat is going and where you want it to go, which port it's going to, even if it's a different port to other people? Does that make sense? So how do you do this? Well, first of all, we need to think really carefully about what we value. And we do something called values clarification to help us do that. And then we think about how we can attain those values. And we can do goal setting and planning and problem solving to do that. So this really lends itself very well to a kind of coaching intervention. So actually, let's do a little bit of it now, because there's a number of values clarification exercises which I describe in Wise Therapy and my second book, Achieve Your Potential, with positive psychology as well. And there's 4 of them. The one that I think we've got time for now is this last one called the Lifeline. So draw a line representing your life and an X where you think where you are on life's journey. So I put an X there, but yours might be there, or it might be there. And just for a moment or two, meditate on that. Meditate on the idea that you're wherever you are, wherever your X is, in terms of your journey through life. See what comes up. Now think of some things you definitely like to do or happen in the rest of your life. And we're going to approach this with 3 questions, which actually shows 3 different sorts of values. So the first question is, what's on your bucket list? What are the things you'd like to do? Would you like to travel places? Would you like to see certain sites? Would you like to have a meal in a particular restaurant? So spend a moment or two jotting down your bucket list things. And of course, the thing is, bucket lists are often suggested for people who have got a terminal diagnosis. But why not do your bucket list earlier when you've still got the health to enjoy it? The second question is, what sort of person would you like to be? So here we're thinking of character qualities, like being a kind person, being assertive, being courageous, having self-control. So what are the character qualities you would like to have? And the third question is, what positive difference would you like to make to the world? So this isn't about the world giving things to you, this is about you giving things back. Might be in a community, might be with your job, might be with a family, might be a legacy, might be some project that you want to complete. So what difference would you like to make to the world so you leave the world a better place? So think about what you'd like to be saying in your rocking chair, perhaps, and add things to those 3 categories. And this is what Emily came up with. Now, Emily found this quite an uncomfortable exercise because she realised she was probably over a third way through her life. So time to crack on and do things. Now, this uncomfortable emotion, I would argue, has got a positive aspect to it. It's sometimes called existential anxiety. And what it's telling us, sometimes emotions give us a message. And the message of existential anxiety is to prioritize the things you need to do to live well. Think about that boat. You've got to steer it to make these things happen, because probably other people have got different agendas. So in Emily's case, the things that she comes to realize are really important are fulfilling her potential, being a good mother, and being kind, and traveling. So, having clarified our values by the Lifeline and other values clarification exercises, we can then work towards it. Now, there are obviously lots of ways you can do that. The framework that I talk about in Achieve Your Potential with Positive Psychology is this step-by-step planning. So let me talk you through this for Emily. So what you do is you pick a value, and let's say she picks her value being a good mother. And so that's her value. And then you set a SMART goal, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And after a bit of thought, and this might take a little while to think of a goal that really lives up to her being a good mother, she chooses, I'm going to read to my daughter for at least 15 minutes a day, and I'm going to start reading her Harry Potter from the beginning, and I'm going to be doing that from tomorrow in next week, and then I'll review it and see how it's going. So it's a nice SMART goal. Now, in step-by-step planning, we realise that these things sometimes take a bit of work to do. So a starting point, let's say she's reading once a week and she's leaving work at 7 several days a week. She's got a busy job. So we've clearly got an obstacle to her achieving this, which is her leaving work on time. So she needs to plan a step to overcome the obstacle, which could be just getting up and leaving, or it could be going into work slightly earlier, or it could be being better at delegating. Let's assume it's being better at delegating, so that would be her step. So does this make sense, this idea that you can, for each of your values, particularly the values that are important to you, particularly the ones which you're not living up to fully now, they don't happen automatically just by you doing values clarification. You have to work at it and actually recording what you want to do, writing it down, telling other people, setting SMART goals, imagining the good things that will happen when you do this are all good ways to help make that happen. So Emily, once she thinks about this, is actually quite excited by that. So you might like to just spend another minute thinking about a value that you'd like to work on. It could be any value from that list, not necessarily one that's just come up from the Lifeline exercise. Think of a SMART goal, something that's specific, measurable, achievable. It will be relevant because it's come up in a value, and time bound. And think of the steps and obstacles you need to take. Let's just jot down something that you'd like to work on in the next week. And who should be here? What do you know? It's the genie. And the genie says, put an X against your top 5 values, because I can see you've got more than 5 now. So, has the process been helpful? Have your top 5 values changed at all? Do you think you can see some ways to achieve them? And of course, we've talked about the step-by-step approach for this. There are lots of tips how to get flow and happiness in various positive psychology books, including the one I wrote. However, you notice coming up behind the genie are 3 friends, and you remember that there weren't 3 theories of the good life, but 4. And who should they be but a bunch of Greek philosophers? We've got Socrates, we've got Aristotle, and we've got the Stoic Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius. The genie clears his throat and says, in quite a formal way, as if this is a really important announcement, so, ladies and gentlemen, before you make your final decision, I'd like you to give serious attention to this 4th theory of the good life. Which of you 3 eminent gentlemen will begin? Aristotle and Marcus both point towards Socrates. Such is the esteem in which he is held. So I don't know if you know much about Socrates, but he's famed for being very humble and modest, but it's a kind of mock humility. And you might suspect this now when he says, I so enjoyed hearing about the good life and all these modern advances. I don't know why we even bothered to think about these things before modern psychology and all its experiments and quantitative analysis and theories. My, how things have moved on. In fact, you don't know me, or I think I'll just go and talk to my friends while you just get on and lead your good lives. Well, there's one thing I'm not sure about actually, which I'm sure you know the answer to, but I've been reading quite a lot of psychology, and I did read that Martin Seligman said that Osama bin Laden could have had PERMA. Now, I know that's not because he thinks bin Laden was a good person. So what does that mean? Well, if you think about it, all of these qualities in PERMA actually could be part of the good life or part of the bad life. So, positive emotions, surely they're good. Well, are they, if they come as a result of a sadist torturing someone? What about flow? Well, what if you get flow through a drug addiction? And what if your positive relationship is with your drug dealer? Meaning, we've already said, isn't such a positive thing if it comes from bin Laden or Hitler, just feeling they've got a meaningful life. And accomplishment, being good at something, isn't so good if the accomplishment is being the best bank robber in your village. So, actually, all of these things, if we teach people to have these things, we might actually be teaching them to have bad lives, not good lives. So what we need, says Socrates, is moral wisdom. Moral wisdom tells us the difference between right and wrong. So actually, I think you should be writing moral wisdom, not just on your list, but as the foundation of your list, the most important thing on your list. Aristotle then comes forward very deferentially and says, I totally agree with you, Socrates, about that. I'd like to also make a case for another type of wisdom, which is practical wisdom. What do we mean by that? We mean the wisdom to decide the best thing to do in any situation. The wisdom that helped King Solomon decide what to do when the two mothers came disputing whose child it was. Now, actually, you need this in all sorts of situations. So supposing your best friend's back with her ex from hell. Now, what do you do with that? Do you say, fantastic, good news, as positive, active, constructive, responding tells us to do in positive psychology? Or are you honest? Or are you just curious? What do you do? So practical wisdom is what you need. So the idea is that how you respond to things, you can't just read it from a rule book and say, oh, just respond positively all the time, because it depends on the context. And practical wisdom is this quality that tells us what to do, what option to take in all the kinds of situations we're in. Now, wisdom is probably the most important of these virtues, but actually, Aristotle, think you need some others as well. And in ancient times, we thought of there being as 4 cardinal virtues. Wisdom was the first, and the other 3 were courage, self-control, and justice. Now, you can think of these in terms of not coming like a rabbit out of a hat, like you might say PERMA does, but from being to do with the nature of human existence. So we human beings have knowledge which we can use well. We face adversity, and we can act well or badly in the face of danger and adversity. We face temptation and emotional disturbances, and we can act well or badly given that we have those things. And we live in communities. Again, we need to act well in the face of our inclination to favour ourselves and those we like or are close to. So the human predicament, if you like, means that we can only reliably steer our boat in the right direction with these key 4 qualities. So think about it. Can you honestly tell me you can reliably lead the good life without these excellences of character? If not, you need to add these to your definition of a good life. Finally, Marcus Aurelius, the great and good Roman emperor, speaks. He says, "We Stoics have developed a very practical philosophy which has helped many of us lead a good life. We agree with Socrates and Aristotle about the importance of the virtues. We also emphasize 2 other ingredients of the good life: accepting with serenity what you can't control, and using reason to guard against irrational judgments that might lead to unnecessary negative emotions." Now, again, I've been catching up with modern developments, and these 2 ideas might well be familiar to you as the Serenity Prayer and as CBT. But, believe me, we Stoics thought of them first. And look, this isn't just a trademark issue. Actually, Stoicism has a coherent recipe for living well. So if you want to know what Marcus Aurelius would do, think of these 3 things that you're doing, and they work in tandem. So you could actually start with any of them. But let's start with Stoic wisdom leading to serenity. So you're thinking, what is under my control and what isn't under your control? And sometimes it's helpful to draw a column and say what is and what isn't under your control. And pretty quickly you come to the conclusion that lots of things we care about, like other people's reactions, the past, wealth, even our health, are not completely under our control. And what is under our control completely is what we do. And the Stoics argue also what is under our control is our judgments about things. So we have this basic idea, which is the Stoic Serenity Prayer, which is we need to focus on what isn't under our control. But again, this isn't something that we just think about and put in a box somewhere. We pay attention to it constantly. So we're thinking about our judgments and thinking, are they rational and ethical? So are they rational? That's partly means, are they logical? But it also means, are we focusing on what's under our control rather than what isn't under our control? Remembering to accept things that aren't under our control. Are they ethical? So actually, this links it with Stoic virtue. So when we're thinking about our judgments, we think about, what does virtue require I do in this situation? What virtue do I need? And what would wisdom dictate I do? What do I need to do? What do I need to accept? Then, having thought through this, that's going to change how we feel, because as every CBT therapist knows, how you think affects how you feel. So if we're thinking that the only things that really matter is virtue, and that we should accept things that aren't under our control, then actually we'll feel pretty serene. So this is, in theory, a tremendous recipe for living a morally good life and living a serene life, and possibly even leading a positively happy life. So that's theory 4. I won't repeat the argument because it's just been told very clearly by those 3 great Greek philosophers who have now shuffled off stage. But I will consider 2 objections that you might well have before you rush and put those 4 virtues in your good life definition. So first of all, it's the word virtue. It's rather a grey word, isn't it? You know, I'm not sure that I would want to say in my rocking chair, I've been virtuous, not as we come to understand it. So think of it more as the Greeks and Romans thought of it, which is as living like an excellent human being, or better still, being a virtuoso at living, or becoming the best version of you. Think about that in your rocking chair, saying, I've been a virtuoso at living. I've lived like the best version of myself. That sounds good, doesn't it? But I can see that you still might be hesitating to add these. And I guess it's that idea that, you know, being virtuous means we're going to sacrifice quite a lot of happiness, and quite a lot of being happy means actually putting ourselves first. So let's look at some research, because this is another great finding of modern psychology. So remember we talked about Ed Diener, the happiness guru? He's fairly recently co-authored an article which is called A Virtuous Cycle, the relationship between happiness and virtue. So remember we were talking about Homer Simpson and how actually being happier would actually probably make us somewhat more virtuous rather than be a donut eating automaton. So that's one direction in which it goes, that being happy tends to lead to us being better human beings. Also, and rather importantly, for theory 4, it goes the other way too. So being virtuous leads to happiness. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's the case. So what we're looking at, I think, is a really interesting picture. So if the good life is the pinnacle of human existence, then we've got two roads to it. We've got the road that positive psychology has mainly been proposing, which is through happiness, PERMA, or subjective values. And we've got the virtuous path to the good life, where we focus on being a good and excellent human being, and we're probably going to reap the benefits of happiness. Now, I've been involved in research that's actually really relevant here, because I was invited to join the team of modern Stoicism led by Professor Christopher Gill at the University of Exeter, and now having many eminent philosophers and therapists, including Donald Robinson and Massimo Puglisi, in it. So what we did starting about 5 or 6 years ago was we thought this Stoicism, this could have something in it, but we don't really know, so let's test it out, and also let's make Stoicism better known. So what we did was, and this was actually the idea of a University of Exeter postgraduate called Patrick Usher. He said, let's do a Stoic week. We'll create a booklet and we'll create audio recordings, and Donald Robertson got particularly involved in doing those things, and other people like John Sellers and Chris. And we'll make it freely available on the internet. We'll suggest things everyone does each week. And then I said, well, let's use some of the things from positive psychology to actually measure it. So we measured well-being and happiness and positive and negative emotions at the start of the week, and we measured at the end. And this would be a good way of seeing whether Stoicism would actually make people happier. And to be honest, I had no idea whether it would, because many people have said, well, this Stoicism, it might stop you being angry, but you're not going to be happier, are you, if you're Stoic? Well, this is what we found. And we've run it year after year, and it's been repeated. So there's a large positive impact on being Stoic for just 1 week. So nearly 3,000 participants in 2017, and a 14% increase in satisfaction with life, for example. So that was fantastic. And people obviously asked questions like, will it stick? So we've done a 3-month follow-up. We've actually done a Stoic month course, which Donald Robertson's created, called Stoic Resilience Training. And then you see after a month there's somewhat greater gains, but after 3 months, that's 3 months after they finish the course, look, it almost completely sticks. Satisfaction with life only down 1% increase. And again, we didn't know whether that would happen. It's a really positive result. Now again, people were suspicious of this. They said, well, you've heard about placebo effects. This is a self-selecting sample. And we'd be the first to admit that these studies we're doing are pilot studies. But we thought we can actually be clever about this, because if we develop a scale to measure how Stoic people are in the true sense of the word, then we can see how Stoic people are, and also see how flourishing and how much positive and negative emotions people have, and we can see the association between them, and through correlation we can see whether there's a positive or negative correlation between being a Stoic and all these measures of well-being. And look at that, they are amazingly high correlations. So for me anyway, So when I started this being involved in modern Stoicism, I was probably about 10% Stoic, and now I would say I'm at least 50% Stoic, because it works, and there's lots of evidence it leads to happiness as well. So it's something to give strong consideration for, I would suggest. So if this is of interest to you, then have a look at these books. We've got the ancient works of Marcus, Epictetus and Seneca, and we've got the modern works of Donald Robertson, Massimo Pigliucci and Ryan Holiday, for example. All worth reading if this sounds of interest. And I'm developing materials myself. I'm particularly interested in how the positive psychology of the virtues, which is some of these books here, what they can bring to the show. And I'm doing a course, teaching a course, which is talking about both versions 3 and 4 of the good life, and how positive psychology and ancient philosophy can help you enhance well-being. And the next Stoic week is in October. So go to modernstoicism.com if you'd like to take part. So that little foray into Stoicism may be enough to convince you that wisdom should be added to your list. So it was for Emily. So look, she's narrowed it down to 5. Obviously, some of these things overlap. So she's ended up with health for herself and her family, developing the best version of herself, which would include all the virtues. She thinks wisdom is worth a special one. Fulfilling her potential is very important. And overall satisfaction with her life is also very important. So again, you might like to spend a minute on your final selection of your 5 top qualities. So we're coming towards the end of our session, and I'd like now to put forward tentatively my own answer to the good life question. So what I think is this: I think all the theories offer part of the solution. We need PERMA, happiness, and the absence of suffering, adjusted for our own subjective values, for what we think is important, so we're pleased with our life. It wouldn't be a good life if we had all the virtues, but we weren't satisfied with it. That's plausible, isn't it? So it seems that this subjective element and some of these values that the psychologists have talked about are pretty important. But I think we also need to be an excellent human being, have the virtues, so that we're not like Osama bin Laden, being a bad human being, and so that we can reliably lead a good life. So it's some combination of these two is what I believe is a good life. So thank you, philosophy, for telling us that. Now, what about positive psychology? Which path should you take? Now, we know it's bidirectional. We know that happiness, etc., leads to virtue and vice versa. But what we don't know yet, really, is the extent of this. And some of the evidence, if you read Ed Diener's article or some of the research, it isn't really clear that being happy leads to a very significant or thorough increase in virtue. And I actually would argue that the reverse is probably more true. For instance, from the Stoic research, it does seem that being virtuous leads to happiness. So I'm thinking that there should be more emphasis on this. Positive psychology has put a lot of focus on PERMA and happiness, and to a lesser extent subjective values, and not so much on the virtues. So I'm really looking forward to advances in how to be more virtuous. So perhaps most of interest to you is this question about how can you personally lead the good life? What can you take from this? There are numerous evidence-based ways to climb towards leading your good life. And the best path is likely to depend both on your own definition of the good life and on where you are at the moment. So here's one roadmap that I'd suggest. First of all, clarify your values using values clarification exercises and reflect on them deeply. Spend a bit of time on them, do a number of them, come back to them when you're in a different mood, write it down. Develop the virtues. using specific advice, for instance, Angela Duckworth on grit, which is part of courage, and also from practical philosophies, such as have a look at the Stoicism material, which is really good about how to develop the virtues, particularly wisdom. You can draw on the positive psychology research to develop happiness and aspects of PERMA. We mustn't forget alleviating suffering, and CBT has got an awful lot of evidence-based tools to help you do that. And you can use general coaching and positive psychology ideas such as step-by-step planning, SMART goals, using your strengths, growth mindset, all those ideas from positive psychology to move towards your specific values. So we have to thank philosophy, positive psychology, and psychotherapy and coaching to help all of us lead our good lives. So what you could well do after this session is to spend a few moments looking at this material and making a plan to how you can use it. And we're coming towards the end of our coaching session, and normally in sessions I would ask something like, what's the most important thing you take from this session? So have a think. If you want, pause it and go through the material again. And the second question is, how can you follow it up? So lots of different ways you can follow it up. You could follow that particular roadmap. You could look at Stoicism. You could buy one of my books. You could email me and arrange your own coaching sessions. You could join one of my courses. I hope this has been useful for you. Whatever you're doing the rest of the day, I hope that it's part of your good life. Bye for now.